I'm Leo Warder for Kit Guru, and this is a Leo Says, which I have not done in absolutely ages. However, the recent Intel financials and all the palaver about 7nm, we can't ignore it. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe. If you're already subscribed, make sure you've hit the bell button. You may find this hard to believe, but Linus has done another video where he shouts at Intel. I mean, who'd have thought that would happen? This particular video, I'm going to paraphrase because you really should watch the whole thing, it's very good, is chastising and rebuking Intel for taking the mickey with the Z490 chipset. If you want the full performance from your new 10th gen Comet Lake S desktop parts, you need the Z490 motherboard chipset, of which I've got, oh, there we go, a few behind me. If you don't go for Z490, if you go for one of the junior chipsets, i.e. a budget motherboard, because Z490 can be expensive, you are restricted in the memory speed you can run. And this just seems utterly ridiculous, because after all, the memory controller is in the processor. Memory speed is nothing whatsoever to do with the chipset whatsoever. It's purely locking you out from getting full performance. And the point here is that 10th gen Comet Lake S runs hot. It takes a lot of power, and as a consequence can run hot. Depends on the motherboard you use. We were, after all, heading towards 300 watts for the CPU, which is just horrendous. However, if you run on auto out of the box, the performance all-core turbo 4.9 gigahertz is really impressive. The fact Intel wants to restrict your memory speed unless you pay them a premium for Z490, it's just wrong. That's all there is to it. And Linus, I think, quite correctly says that overclocking the processor, minimal returns, therefore go for increased memory speed, you get more benefit. I think he's absolutely right. Therefore, Intel's hamstringing sub Z490 motherboards purely for the market and for margin, and that's just wrong. Why it's particularly wrong is that the people buying Z490 motherboards are the enthusiasts, and in the DIY market, that is, in other words, building their own PCs, and they are of are a vanishing breed. The idea that Intel rewards you if you buy one of the Z490 boards and the Comet Lake S processor and some decent DDR4 and all the rest of it, which is going to cost you a lot of money. The idea they penalize you if you don't buy Z490, if you go down market, that's just wrong. Intel recently held one of their quarterly financial calls, as we reported on Kit Guru, and the boss, Bob Swan, said many things, including profits are up. You got to love the sales of those Xeons, haven't you? He also said that he, Bob Swan, is not pleased with our 7nm process performance. The upshot is that Intel 7nm is 12 months behind schedule. What schedule? The schedule that they have talked about, therefore it's an entirely nebulous thing. However, whatever schedule they're talking about, they're behind that. Being 12 months behind, you would think would delay products by 12 months, but no, it's going to delay 7nm products by 6 months. And the only way that makes any sense is if the initial phase when they're rolling out products at a steady state to learn the process, understand what's going on, bin the products correctly, build up stocks, they're just ditching that, which means that day one of when they can actually produce chips is the day when they're allegedly selling chips, and they're going to have no stocks to speak of, and who knows if things are going to work correctly. Also, Bob said that, my mistake, Mr. Swan, said that they'd identified an actual problem with 7nm. I don't think they actually said they've fixed it yet, but they have identified it, therefore they're ready to get going. A few days after the financial call, in which time Intel's share price had dropped significantly and AMD's had picked up as the full impact of what had been said sunk in, Bob Swan reorganised Intel's internal structure. As a consequence, Murthy Renduchintala, the boss of 7nm, found he no longer had a job. You cannot take away anything from that other than 7nm is bad. The thing is, the 10nm process continues to be this slow rolling ongoing catastrophe. Jim at Adored TV, after the financials but before it was announced that Murthy's out the door, said at the end of his video about 7nm,
the very next day they followed up with this: 7 is looking worse than 10. I'll catch you later, guys.
The thing is that Intel simply cannot take a second catastrophe, and by catastrophe I mean 10 nanometer is a single catastrophe. You could obviously break it down to a number of catastrophes, but let's say it's one, in which case 7 would be a second catastrophe. The thing is, Intel can muck us journos around all they like, and indeed the buying public. They can produce a laptop and say it's this or that or the other, and provided it is after a fashion, then it's true. Where they cannot pull the wool over the eyes is with the Aurora Supercomputer. Delivery date for Aurora has slipped already. It is now due to be delivered in 2021, according to Intel's own newsroom. This frankly seems unlikely, but that is what they say. And Aurora is due to run on Sapphire Rapids CPUs and Ponte Vecchio GPUs. Ponte Vecchio is interesting because Intel has gone on the record saying it's going to be 7 nanometer. The first headline product on 7 nanometer is graphics rather than CPUs. Ponte Vecchio is important. Ponte Vecchio is absolutely critical to Aurora. I asked Intel the question, is the hardware for Aurora still Sapphire Rapids and Ponte Vecchio? After all, the situation might have changed, and I was told Aurora is built on Sapphire Rapids and Ponte Vecchio. Sapphire Rapids is a next generation 10 nanometer based Xeon scalable processor that will offer advances in performance, AI and other areas. Sapphire Rapids will be the CPU used in the Aurora exascale supercomputer system at Argonne National Lab. We expect to start initial production shipments of Sapphire Rapids in the second half of 2021. Our data center GPU design, Ponte Vecchio, will now be released in late 2021 or early 2022, utilizing external and internal process technologies combined with our world-leading packaging technologies. The significance there being that Ponte Vecchio is a multi-part assembly. It uses an I/O die, possibly an interposer, GPU dies obviously, and HBM. Intel was never going to make the HBM, so by definition they're going to get parts in from other people. They're going to have to, in their own words, glue them together. The question being is which part is going to be 7 nanometer Intel. Happily we get a kind of a heads up. Intel is due to deliver 10 nanometer Ice Lake server at the end of 2020. If Intel cannot do that, then we'll know that 10 nanometer is in a really bad way, because at the moment they can just about do quad-core parts for thin light laptops. If they can't do Ice Lake server, goodness knows where they're going to go with the big stuff such as Sapphire Rapids. If 10 nanometer ends up being stuck at the end of this year, then you have even less faith that 7 nanometer is going to happen. That may not be entirely logical, but after all, if you have an ongoing continuing disaster, then how is the next better thing actually going to be a thing? And here's my thought on this. Over the years we've seen companies that have sold off their fabs and gone fabless. Off the top of my head I can't think of a single fab that has stopped at a certain node because they've just hit a roadblock and then they've recovered and moved on. If Intel has truly mucked it up with 10 nanometer and they have the same happen again with 7 nanometer, you have to start wondering whether Intel's actually stuck back at 14 nanometer, which clearly works very well. If that turns out to be true, then quite clearly Intel's roadmaps just go up in smoke. They're absolutely just destroyed. The funny thing is that for we enthusiasts in the DIY market, that might not necessarily be the end of the world. We're expecting at the end of this year to see Intel's 11th gen Rocket Lake parts. They will have a new architecture. They're going to move to Willow Cove. Therefore, we're expecting a decent uptick in IPC, 15% or whatever the number is, but a significant move on from Skylake. After all, Skylake is now antique. In addition, we're expecting to see PCI Express Gen 4 when Nvidia brings out RTX 3000 Ampere with PCI Express Gen 4 interface. If Intel stuck on Gen 3, that's just hopeless for enthusiasts. The Core i9 part is expected to be an 8-core 16 thread, which is clearly a step back from the existing 10-core 20 thread part. However, if you get more IPC, you might end up with the same performance for significantly less power than the current 10-core. That would be good. So the fact that 11th gen Rocket Lake is going to be on 14 nanometer plus is kind of a detail. And then we have the Intel 12th gen Alder Lake. This is the part that's moving from the brand new current LGA 1200, which will also be used with Rocket Lake, to LGA 1700 and presumably yet another new chipset, presumably Z590. Alder Lake is this radical design that's going to have 8 big CPU cores and 8 little atom cores, so 8 plus 8 cores. You'd think that might be 8 plus 8 equals 16 cores, albeit 2 types of core, giving you 32 threads. But apparently not. In hybrid mode, when both types of core are working together, it seems hyperthreading will be disabled. And obviously this is all rumours at the moment. We have no clue whether that could be on the fly or kind of turn the system on with hyperthreading disabled or enabled, depending. The other thing is that with Alder Lake, because this is presumably H2 of next year, that means we're straight in the territory of 10 nanometer on the desktop if Bob Swan is correct. If Ice Lake at the end of this year on 10 nanometer is just a no-go, then that would suggest that Alder Lake is going to be yet another 14 nanometer part, which sounds like an absolute catastrophe. However, Alder Lake is due to use DDR5, it will have Golden Cove architecture, and that combination of 8 plus 8 cores, therefore you'd hope hugely efficient on the power front. PC enthusiasts want performance, ideally with temperatures that aren't white hot, but performance is what it's about. Power efficiency is nice, but it is not critical. So we, enthusiasts on 14 nanometer, it's not the end of the world. However, other markets, servers in particular, also to a certain extent workstations, they want power efficiency. Power costs them plenty. Their computers are all about money, particularly on the server side of things. Efficiency is absolutely critical. They have to get off 14 nanometer. 10 nanometer is way overdue. 7 nanometer, yep, they want that as well. So Ice Lake for the end of this year is really important. But for the Aurora Supercomputer, it's just beyond a joke. How Intel's going to ship Aurora next year, I do not begin to understand. If it slips to early 2022, that's bad, but it needs to happen. If it doesn't, Intel's going to have egg all over their face. I have every confidence AMD and Nvidia are going to deliver this year. I've got very little faith that Intel will, and I'm going to be watching this space with keen interest. Ice Lake at the end of this year, please, Intel. There we have it. That was Leo Says. I'm Leo Wood for Kit Guru.